So I finally finished reading the Denial of Death. They're just the last two chapters. And I'll say this, if you've read all the chapters up to this point, both of these chapters you could have predicted and you kind of probably already intuitively understand. The first one is a general view of mental health. And the ideas inside this chapter are ones that are particularly obvious at this point if you've read this many chapters. And it's good mental health is good heroics, or like you're engaged in a good hero culture. And bad mental health is a failure to engage in some kind of heroics or kind of like a fear of life. And he gives a couple of examples. I'll name two. So the first one is depression. And with depression, he thinks that it is a kind of fear of life as a result of a fear of death. And so how does he explain this? Well, with depression, it is like a lack of doing something, he says. He argues that it's a lack of engaging in things. And the reason why you're not engaging in things is because you're afraid of your immortal thing dying. What does that mean? So for him, the fear of death creates this reflex called hero culture, if you remember. And in order to engage in hero culture, you need this myth, this kind of lie that you tell yourself. He goes back to like chapter 2 or 3 where he talks about all culture is hero culture and is fundamentally a lie. And so you're telling yourself this lie. Well, the depressed person doesn't want their lie to die. And since the lie is supposed to be the thing that makes them immortal, the thing that transcends their creaturely nature, their symbolic ideals that makes them immortal, since they don't want that to die, they don't participate in it. They don't risk the failure. And so he actually argues that depression is a kind of coping mechanism, right? Because you're defending yourself from the potential downsides of your hero culture dying, your immortal thing dying. Another one was perversion. So he talks about perversions. I don't know if he means it like in an old sense or if he means it in a derogatory sense, but he uses the word perversion. And he says that with perversions, what it is a denial of your creaturely nature. So it's like you're almost becoming too symbolic. And he says, for example, that if you take someone who likes shoes but doesn't like feet, he gives these examples of patients he interviewed who liked shoes but didn't like feet. And he says that this is a case where the shoe represents something symbolic, and introducing that symbolism into their sex drive gets rid of the species determinism of just using sex as a reproductive thing. And that, therefore, is the denial of creaturely nature. So you're introducing symbolism into something that is creaturely, which then denies creaturely nature. That's another example of how his general view of mental health can be communicated in terms of either too symbolic, no, we're not symbolic enough, or too creaturely, or not creaturely enough. Which is, I think, pretty obvious if you've read the previous chapters that this was going to happen. This is going to be a conclusion from his worldview. Now, the next chapter after this, which is the final chapter, is called Psychology and Religion. And it's actually quite a broad chapter. And it touches on, I think, 3 core ideas, at least ones that I could extract. And I'm going to deal with those in turn. So the first one is that man needs a hero culture. You can't remove culture from anybody, well, from most people, because if you remember in earlier chapters, he said that basically the only people who can create their own individual hero culture are like symbolic geniuses, people who are really, really into the symbolic side, because they're so removed from society that they have to create their own meaning or become psychotic. That's his framing of it. You might not agree with that. It's pretty contentious. But so as a result of that, the conclusion is that you need some kind of mainstream culture for people to latch onto to engage in a hero culture. So that way they're not just riddled with the fear of death. And as a result, engage in depression or like just become completely inactive in society. That's one conclusion that he draws. The next one is that there's no personal utopias. So because we fundamentally have a fear of death, that he thinks the human condition forbids utopia. So he talks about like self-help gurus who say, if you just become enlightened and live in the now, you're going to be free from all your stress and all your problems. He thinks that that's nonsense. And because of the human condition, namely the fear of death, we're never going to have a utopia. Which brings us to the last point that he talks on, which is a point that gets brought up by Freud and Jung quite a lot. And it's that therapy is not a cure or a solution, and there is no cure or solution. And he talks about how, like in Christianity, you can talk about like being born again, or how different self-help philosophies might talk about how you need to become an actualized human, or self-actualization is what you require to be happy. He says these are religions in some sense. They're just beliefs that aren't based in reality for him. And I kind of agree with that, actually. The idea that like therapy will replace human nature is also something he talks about is not true. He thinks that there's always going to be something about the human condition that as a result makes therapy unable to solve some of these problems. So like, for example, the fact that you're mortal, this is always going to be a problem that you can't remove by simply just doing therapy. You're always going to have to deal with that issue. The finite nature of your existence, your behaviors reminding you that you're finite, right? So like getting sick, going to the washroom, things like this, right? Things that require you to address your mortal existence are always going to have the things that you have to address. And so in some sense, he says that psychology or self-help or whatever has become like a new religion where they make promises that they're never going to realize, that like you're going to be stress-free and so on and so forth. Kind of mixes that in with these two sections called the limits of psychotherapy and the limits of human nature. And that's the end of the book. Now, my general conclusion from this book is that I don't agree with everything that was said, obviously. A lot of people seem to think that because I'm representing his views as clear as I can, that I therefore agree with them. I don't. I actually disagree with most of what was said. But I will say that they do follow, like these conclusions, these ideas he's making, do follow from the axioms that he's built up in chapter 1 and to some extent chapter 2. He did build those axioms up and then drew these conclusions, and I think they follow, which makes the book a little bit interesting. I think that part is quite fun to read. But other than that, he does read like his predecessors, which he does quote a lot to his credit, like Rank or Freud, or even to some extent Jung. He reads like them, except in his case, rather than like sex or jealousy or some kind of neurotic emotion being the foundation of his worldview, it's the fear of death. He kind of just replaces everything with the fear of death, which, okay, yeah, that kind of does, it's like an oversimplification of human nature. Not everything can be rooted back to the fear of death, especially when you consider things like possible random mutations. He's very, very heavy on the social side of things as well, I should say. He doesn't talk about biology and how there could be biological explanations of things, which, in his defense, this book is about psychodynamics, but I think he was a bit too zealous in his explanations. I think he overestimates how much psychodynamics plays a role in causing human behavior. So you have to read the book with some skepticism. But out of this like general skepticism towards his belief system, it is fun. It was a fun read. I like when people build systems. I find a lot of authors don't build systems anymore. They kind of just read some studies and maybe have a theory. But he was actually not really citing too many studies. He was building a system, right? He was throwing out axioms and then showing the general conclusions that would follow from those axioms and how those axioms can be used to reinterpret data as opposed to like using data to support his worldview. So yeah, I would say I'd recommend reading it just for that alone. If you're like a serious reader, that alone is going to be the reason why you want to read it. But if you're just looking for some actual like practical and useful stuff, then this book is not going to be for you. Especially if you feel like death anxiety or something, this book will definitely not be for you. It doesn't help with that at all. There's another book called Death Benefits that might be better for you. But overall, I'd say this book is like a 7. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. I'll be generous with this book because I really enjoyed it. With that being said, guys, if you have another book you want me to read like chapter by chapter and review it with you, let me know. The next one I will do is Debt by David Graeber. I forget his name. It's this book, Debt. It's a very famous book. It's quite a long book as well. I think, yeah, David Graeber. I'll read this chapter by chapter and talk about each chapter. Or maybe I'll synthesize, because there's quite a lot of chapters. Maybe I'll synthesize like 5 chapters at a time. I don't know. If you have a book you want me to read like this, let me know. And with that being said, bye-bye.